conference. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Stephen Dinham. Steve is very much a friend of public education, beginning his teaching career in public schools in New South Wales, secondary schools, before being appointed in 1989 to the University of Western Sydney, where he held a number of positions, including the head of the Department of Curriculum Studies, Associate Dean, Postgraduate and Associate Professor. In 2002, he took up a position as Professor of Teacher Education, Pedagogy and Professional Development at the University of New England. 2005, he took up the position of Professor of Educational Leadership and Pedagogy at the University of Wollongong. And in 2007, he took up the position of Research Director of the Teaching, Learning and Leadership Research Program at the Australian Council for Educational Research, and his current position at the University of Melbourne in 2011. He's conducted a wide range of research projects in the area of educational leadership and change, effective pedagogy, quality teaching and student achievement, postgraduate supervision, professional teaching standards, teachers' professional development, leadership, teacher satisfaction, motivation and health, and has an extensive publication record that I'm sure many of you have accessed and read. It was Steve Dinham who sounded a timely warning, and you may remember the slide in my opening address on the first day of conference with the reference to the tsunami, where Steve has really sounded out a clarion warning to the profession that with the rise of the commercialisation of education globally, that we, like a tsunami, these long waves can take a long time to reach shore, and once you see them coming, then often it's too late to outrun it. And that's a very powerful metaphor. Steve's also has written a brilliant paper called The Worst of Both Worlds, the negative impact of the US and UK education policies on Australia. So he's doing some very interesting work, and I'd like you to please make him welcome. Professor Stephen Dinham.
Thanks everybody, it's nice to be back in Sydney and in New South Wales. What Maury didn't mention was that in 1972 I joined the New South Wales Teachers Federation as an 18-year-old student teacher. But I did do my schooling in public schools in New South Wales, and I did my teaching there as well. These sorts of things I'm going to be talking about this morning, I think, are substantial fundamental changes, and they're happening almost under the radar. And I think we really need to mobilise ourselves to question, critique and resist some of these things. You'll notice on the bottom of the slide, I'm also the National President of the Australian College of Educators. That's a professional association which covers government, non-government educators from early childhood through to university. And while a lot of the things I'm saying about public education, one of the points I make to the membership of ACE is that a good public education system is good for everyone. It isn't just for a particular sector of the community. So let's start with GOF. And I think we are in danger of doing that. This is the overview of what I'd like to talk about in the time I've got. Some of the supposed problems with education, and when I say supposed, these things have been beaten up to a large extent for various purposes. And then some of these big ideas which are sort of happening, and obviously you're well aware of a number of these, they're on the agenda for this conference. Government-funded independent and for-profit schools, greater school autonomy, deregulation, moving teacher education to schools, or you could say back to schools, and a growing presence for the publishers and big business. Now, almost 20 years ago, David Berliner and Bruce Biddle published a very important document. It was about American education, but it talked about a manufactured crisis in public education. Claims being made, for example, things being beaten up where there was no actual evidence to support them. In fact, the evidence was in many cases contra. Now, if anything, the attacks on public education in America have intensified, and they've been mirrored on the other side of the Atlantic in the UK, for example. And because, for whatever reasons, and for better or worse, we do tend to copy what the Americans and the British do, we are going down these tracks. Now, More recently, they produced a follow-up 50 lies or 50 myths and lies that threaten America's public schools, the real crisis in education. And it's pretty scary reading because it really points out how things have not got better at all since their first book 20 years previous. One of the things that happens is that if you say these things often enough, they become facts in people's eyes. Pasi Sahlberg's talked about this, the fact that these things become part of the public consciousness. Now, one of the key things here, I think, is that educational research, educators have been bypassed, ignored in all of this. Now, sometimes it's our own fault. In the case of educational research, often it's obscure, it's not seen to be practical or relevant, and unfortunately, one of the things that frequently happens is we can't provide the evidence to support what we say. This has created a bit of a vacuum, and I think governments have stopped listening to educators. They're listening to the economists, they're listening to the big business people and so forth. We need to reframe our message, I think. One of the things that happens, of course, is these quick fix solutions, and this is the corporate influence. So, for example, when the previous Victorian government was elected a few years ago, one of the first things they announced was they were going to sack the bottom 5% of teachers. Now, whatever the bottom means, I don't know, you'd have to define that, but you'd also have to think about the processes that would be required to appraise every teacher in Victoria and to train the people doing the appraisal, and then to go through a process that would be fair in terms of dismissing this so-called bottom 5%. And then, of course, you're faced with the situation, well, who do we replace them with? Plainly, those sorts of quick fix solutions, bonus pay, sacking people, non-educators as principals and so on, have a lot to be desired, but they're very popular out there. So what are some of these problems? This is my sort of top 20 that I've put together over the last little while. One of the things I point out to colleagues in the non-government sector is you better be careful of these changes because they're going to be just as disruptive to you as they are in the public sector. They're powerful ideas that have got into the public consciousness. Now, one of the things that people like to point out, of course, is the fact that you can look at the spending on education over the last 10 or 15 years and see that spending's gone up while results have supposedly gone down. Well, if that's a true inverse relationship, you can very readily fix education, just cut back on the funding. It doesn't quite work that way. Now, this is an interesting one because the research shows us the teacher's the biggest in-school influence on student achievement, not the biggest. And that in-school's been mislaid, whether by accident or design. Now, the problem here, when this first started to emerge from the research, and the research that I was doing and other people were doing as well, I thought this is a very positive thing because what it means is that we would be, I think, forced to focus on how do we better develop and support our most important resource, which is the classroom teacher in the school. But in fact, it's been turned on its head so that when students fail to learn, it's the teacher's fault. And as I said, that in-school reference has been lost. And of course, we know that there are a lot of other things that lead and feed into student achievement. That very simplistic notion. And if you talk to people, particularly in the corporate sector, they will tell you, well, you know, just base it on test results. Well, I think we know better which test results and how do we attribute the performance of a student to a particular teacher. It's not as simple as selling insurance or whatever. This has been popular, particularly in the US. Well, what results? Now, is that our job? Is it our job to provide what a particular industry wants today? And that's a very simplistic one as well. Changes some things, but in some ways it makes some of the fundamentals even more important. I mean, some people will tell you, well, we don't need teachers to be experts in everything because everything's out there on the internet. You know, we just need to be the guide by the side or whatever. In actual fact, we need good teachers more than ever to help students negotiate all that material that's out there. We're not talking about the Encyclopaedia Britannica anymore. We're talking about a massive stuff out there. Anybody can teach. Anybody can teach anything. We should give up on some people. You can run a small business, real estate agency and so on. Why can't you be a principal? And this final one, which is the sort of all-encompassing one. Choice, competition, privatisation and the free market are the answers to almost any question about education. So those things have become, I think, deeply rooted into the public consciousness, into politicians, into business, and we need to question them. But we have to question them from a basis of evidence. So this is the problem. The research evidence in many cases says these things don't work, and yet we introduce them. We've got the research from the UK and the US and so forth, but in actual fact it seems to encourage some people. And what this feeds into is a further decline in public confidence, particularly in public education, which leads to pressure for more change. So this is a thing that feeds upon itself. In fact, Pasi Sahlberg calls it the germ, the global education reform movement, and it does act in the way of some sort of organic system. So what do we see in Australian education? Great pressure for alternative school establishment, funding, issues around teacher quality, some of which are very simplistic, changes to school governance and leadership and school accountability changes. So I want to go through and unpack the big five, basically. Government-funded, independent, for-profit schools. Now, Christopher Pyne obviously is a fan of these. They were introduced in Western Australia. The evidence from an evaluation which was conducted there by coincidentally, the Centre for Program Evaluation at the University of Melbourne, led by Janet Clinton and John Hattie, found that those schools had no impact on student achievement. But that didn't stop anybody from advocating for them, because obviously there's an ideological background to this that goes back to neoliberalism in the 1930s. So he was hoping for a third of all public schools, or they were a third, and he was basically hoping to see another 1,500 across Australia. Now, this is, of course, is a copy of what's happening overseas. In the US, we've had charter schools for some time. We've got free schools in the UK, and we've got chains and academies. Now, the way a charter school works, I'm sure you're familiar with, but you can start a school if you want to. You might be a charity, you might be a business. You can start a school, you can get a charter, in effect, a licence to run a school. Now, one of the key things here is that in those schools, in many cases, you are exempt from the same requirements of people in other forms of schooling, including traditional government schooling and independent schooling. I'll come back to that point later on there. I've visited some of these in places like California, for example. Often they're not in school buildings at all. They're in old factories or aircraft hangars or whatever it happens to be. And ostensibly, because they get public money, they're supposed to be for the general public, but in actual fact they're not. They engage in screening. So, for example, if you're convinced that you need to send your child to the local charter school, you'll have to fill out maybe a 3-page essay on why your child should go to that school, which is a good test of your literacy, obviously, and what you're prepared to do to contribute to that school. And then what they tend to do, and I saw this with my own little eyes, classes of 40 and 50 and 60 and 70 14-year-olds being basically drilled on the scholastic aptitude test that they will take to get into college. So what basically happens is frequent examinations and kids being weeded out. So at the end of the day, they can say, well, we got X% of our kids into college, aren't we doing a wonderful job? And by the way, the school that I visited was in an old factory. They had no sporting fields. When they wanted to use the facilities thing, for, a game of volleyball or a game of softball or something, they had to hire them from a public school. So the kids were playing sport at 9 o'clock at night. Free schools, similar story in the UK. People can open a school, charities, businesses, other groups, and obtain the funding that goes with that. Now, the evidence on free schools has been pretty damning. Some of them, the ones that have been trumpeted by people like Tony Blair at the time, for example, have either had their principals removed or they've been closed or they've had restrictions placed upon them. So one of the key things here, and I'll get back to this point later about autonomy, autonomy needs to be balanced by accountability. And one of the problems with these new type of schools is that in many cases they aren't subject to the same accountabilities that public education and independent schools in their traditional sense are subject to. So you see things, for example, in New Zealand, they've passed legislation here, they don't have to employ registered teachers. Often the staff are on contracts, some of which prevent union membership. And they, as I said there, they can be exempt from planning regulations. Some of them are cyber schools. So in the US, there's something like 300,000 or 400,000 students being taught over the internet. And one of the biggest providers comes from Mexico. So the kids are supposed to be taught online with the support of their parents who act as sort of tutors. Now, where the results, and that paper that Maury mentioned, The Worst of Both Worlds, has this in detail, where the results for students at those cyber schools have become available, they are appalling. They are well below the state averages in many US states, and those state averages aren't particularly high in some cases. Now, as you know, the way it works in Australia is that non-government primary and secondary schools can receive public funding providing they maintain their non-profit status. So in effect, they operate on the basis of a charity. Now, that's not going to last. There's a couple of big organisations. One's called Fairview Global, based in Malaysia, and one's called GEMS Education, based in Dubai. These are for-profit schools, not in the strict traditional sense that we know in Australia. And they're on record as saying they plan to enter the Australian market. So watch this space. Now, Diane Ravitch, as you would probably be aware, has been a vocal critic of a lot of this and talks about the charter schools. So few charters actually want the students for whom charters were first invented. They'll make them look bad. They'll pull them down. They were supposed to be laboratories for bold innovations, etc. So one of the arguments about autonomy is letting people be free at last, so you can innovate and be flexible and do all those sorts of things. But in actual fact, some of them exhibit a worse form of regimentation you'd see in any school. And despite, of course, the fact they receive public funding, they see themselves as direct competition or indirect competition with public schools. So that's the continuation of the quote from Diane Ravitch. And there is real fear in the US that the public education system there has been so severely damaged it won't recover. And then what happens then is the question. Now back to David Berliner again, and I'm sorry this is a long quote, but I think it's pretty powerful stuff. Now, when you measure using things like public examination, standardised tests and so on, some charter schools perform a tiny bit better than the regular public school, but in many cases they do actually do worse. And Stanford University, which is a reasonably reputable organisation, 80% of charter schools are either no better or worse than traditional public schools. But what they have been doing is two things. They've been siphoning off funding, but they've also been, to some degree, destroying confidence in public education. Now, the UK version's the free school and the academies and chains that go with this. Some of these public schools that have been converted to free schools, others have been built from the ground up. In some cases, schools that have been ostensibly failing have been offered the chance to become a free school. So again, the perceived advantages are greater autonomy, scope for innovation, result in higher student attainment. And again, parents, teachers, businesses, charities, various people have been put in charge of these. Now, some concerns, and again, there's too much text on that, but it's important stuff, I think. The application process itself is a form of social screening, socio-economic screening. So despite the fact they get the public funding, they don't take everybody. There's also the issue of cost, effectiveness, the fact that there's less accountability for these sorts of schools, which is part of the attraction for people to actually set them up, I suspect. The social selection I've mentioned there. So it makes it very, very difficult to compare on a level playing field the results of these sorts of schools with your average public school alongside it. Now, Sweden has got about 1,000 free schools, and they've had them longer than the UK. We're a little bit early maybe to be definitive about the UK, but Sweden's had them for a long time. Now, in fact, two countries which went down the free school route very, very strongly were Sweden and Chile, and they're both trying to get back again, not surprisingly. No more successful in terms of performance than comparable mainstream schools. But, and the but is the funding that's diverted and the damage that's done to perceptions in the public about those sorts of schools. It's one of those things where kids care for the parents care for their kids, I should say. They want to do the best for them. If they're convinced the best for them is to move them to a different sort of school, they'll probably try and do that if they can. Now, greater school autonomy, the second of these big waves. When I was researching this, I went to various websites, the UK, the US, Australia, and on all those government education websites, they all say the same thing. Overwhelming international evidence shows that greater autonomy for schools leads to improved student performance, but they never cite the evidence. And I'm somebody who's interested in evidence and I can't find it. They're all citing each other. So there's the UK. We believe it will help raise standards, but the evidence is not referenced. As I said, everybody references each other. So this is the Australian Department of Education website. Evidence emphasises the advantages of school autonomy as part of a comprehensive strategy for school improvement, etc. There's an awful lot of rhetoric about this, but there's very little evidence. But I will get to the evidence in a moment. In fact, some of the manifestos, you could call them, almost read word for word. They've been passed around. People have been sharing their homework. Now, David Hopkins has looked at the evidence of this. Now, he's not entirely correct with that last bit, and I just want to talk about that for a moment. You will hear that there's no correlation between school autonomy and student achievement. There's a small one, but it's a very important thing. The PISA data shows that where schools have got more autonomy over things like how they organise themselves internally and how they use their resources, and, there's a big and it's balanced by external accountabilities through having to follow a curriculum, employ registered teachers, public examinations, the sort of stuff we have in Australia. Where there's autonomy over key internal functions like that, and there's a balance to accountability, there is a small improvement in student performance of something like up to 5 points on some of the PISA tests. But, and this is the big but, where there is greater autonomy for schools and there are no counterbalancing accountabilities like we see with the charter schools and like we see with the free schools, results are actually worse, all right, by about 4 to 5 points. So there is a correlation that works both ways there. Now, this is the McKinsey report, which is quite influential. Sir Michael Barber, who's now gone to work for Pearson, but that's another story. Differences in what leaders do are not directly related to the level of autonomy they are given. internationally, there's no relationship between the degree of autonomy enjoyed by a school principal and their relative focus on administrative or instructional leadership. I do a lot of work in leadership and leadership preparation, run courses and so on, and the fact is, as you all know, within any system which has the same checks and balances and accountabilities, there are some principals, for example, who are really focused on teaching and learning in their school, and they can really get things happening with the support of their staff and people working together and being motivated and so on. You can see that. On the other hand, if that's not the case, those results aren't forthcoming. PISA shows this, NAPLAN shows this really clearly, particularly low SES schools. Leadership does make a substantial difference, but it's not the amount of autonomy they've got, it's how they actually use what they have, not the level overall of accountability, if that makes sense. So a key aspect is autonomy over what. So what we saw in Victoria, for example, I think there was a very effective system of networks and regions. Those networks were removed by the previous government, and that cut people adrift. They had more autonomy, but in fact what they were cut adrift in the lifeboat, and it had holes in it because funding was being cut. So what tended to happen was that when something happened, like a crisis, for example, there was no support from the network, the region. People were on their own. So you need to define what it is when politicians and people from business and so on talk about autonomy. Autonomy over what? We need to question that. Because often it's accompanied by less funding and less systemic support when things go wrong. Now, I'm going to talk about deregulation. And one of the powerful ideas here is that, again, it's part of the autonomy argument, deregulation, privatisation, exposing organisations to market forces will lead them to flourish. Now, I spent a reasonable amount of time in Germany, and I had a 3-month scholarship last year where I visited a lot of German schools, universities, ministers' offices and all that sort of stuff. When PISA was first released in 2000, the Germans got what they call PISA shock. They hadn't done nearly as well as they thought they had. And it's a very regulated system in Germany. It's very regulated in terms of teacher training, 7 years to become a teacher, a whole lot of exams and so forth. It's all tightly controlled. They were able to use their tight regulation through the 16 states, Orlando, to lift their performance since 2000. Every year since 2000, they've gone up in their results. They're only one of 3 nations, along with Mexico and Turkey, to improve their results on mathematics on PISA and equity. Because one of the things that sometimes happens is that when results improve, equity actually gets worse, and there are all sorts of complications with that. But the point there is that Germany was able to use its tightly regulated system to improve its performance on that one measure. But they also did a whole lot of other stuff too. They become much more aware of diversity and inclusion and how they could deal with refugees and migrants and so forth. At the same time, of course, since 2000, our results have been going down, and I don't think it's any coincidence that we've become more and more deregulated in that period of time. So ironically, a tightly regulated system can be more responsive when it needs to be than maybe one that's being increasingly deregulated. Now, part of this, of course, is, which should be overlooked too. I think in Germany, it's about 92% of kids go to government schools. In Australia, of course, it's about 65 and falling, obviously. So we've already got one of the most privatised education systems in the world. We already have that. Certainly by OECD standards, it's probably the most privatised. The other big thing that's driving this is user pays. And of course, user pays is predicated on how much money you got in your pocket. But also, we've stopped, I think, talking about education as being an investment in the personal, social and economic prosperity of the nation. It's become a commodity to be purchased. And the commitment, for example, in VET and in TAFE, I think is, well, the lack of commitment is actually disgraceful. And what we saw in Victoria with the cutbacks there to TAFE in those regional remote areas, there will be a price to pay. The current government's trying to reverse it, but there will be a price to pay. We know from the big international research that for every year we keep kids involved in meaningful education and training, it pays off. It pays off in life expectancy, the overall income of the country, health outcomes, social outcomes. There are some states in the US that work out how many prison beds they're going to need. And you know what the best proxy is? High school dropout rates. If the high school dropout rate goes up, they'll need more prison beds. And I'm not making that up. Now, of course, this notion of schools operating as businesses has a few flaws. If you're a business, you can exert control over the inputs and so forth. You can refuse to take certain things if they don't meet your standards. Obviously, in public education in particular, we take everybody, and from all geographic and SES areas. And again, that's a quote from Diane Ravitch. It's a long one, but it's a good one. And of course, that's the problem when your main proxy is public test scores. So that's a fundamental flaw, in a way, in running schools as businesses. Now, if they were to run as businesses, you'd expect to do the usual things we do in business. You're going to be successful, you've either got to cut costs or you've got to increase revenue, or both. Highest costs in schools are associated with labour, usually 80% of the cost in most organisations. So, if you're going to reduce your labour costs, you've either got to have fewer staff and or pay them less. So, larger class sizes, fewer qualified teachers are the obvious means of achieving this. One of the things with some of the charter schools, the free schools, what was trumpeted in New Zealand and so on, was this notion you could circumvent the need to employ a registered teacher. You can employ tutors of various sorts. Now, watch this space very, very carefully. And then, of course, the other side of it is attracting more students and or higher tuition fees. And if you can get the money from the government, of course, to prop this up and subsidise it, so much the better. I've mentioned the cyber schools. Obviously, if your parent has to be your learning coach, that's a very, very strong way of reinforcing disadvantage. Particularly if your mother, father has not had an adequate education themselves, may not even have their English as their first language, etc. Now, moving teacher education to schools, or back to schools in fact, which is where it was about 150 years ago. Because make no mistake, there's been some unrelenting attacks on teacher education, and they continue. The situation in England now is that, for example, schools can get a fee, £8,000 I believe it is at the moment, around about that, to train a teacher. So teacher education's been actively moved out of those hotbeds of socialism, faculties of education, and into schools. Now, just in the US context, these alternative providers of education. Now, in some cases, this is a means of overcoming shortage or getting people into schools where it's difficult to attract teachers. But the lack of qualification, in some cases the low level of training, obviously is of great concern. And again, it's one of those things that reinforces disadvantage. Now, 1 in 5 in the US is now being trained, teachers are being trained in some form of alternative certification program. One of the things about teacher education in the US is that the gap between the top and the bottom is enormous. You have your Stanfords and you have your Harvards and your Vanderbilts and so on, most of which train few teachers but have very high standards. And then it goes all the way down. That gap is getting much wider. We are repeating that in Australia, and I'll get back to that point in a moment. But anyway, the non-college programs, very low admission standards, do not ensure that candidates are prepared to teach every subject to which they're assigned and provide in-support candidates as they take on full-time teaching responsibilities. One of the things I've been extremely critical of in this country is our lack of workforce planning in education. It's made worse by the deregulation, there's that word again, the deregulation of undergraduate places for teacher education. So some universities are basically ramping up as much as they possibly can to take as many people as they can. That's the cash cow syndrome. So we've got a situation where there is an imbalance, for example, between primary teachers and secondary teachers. We have severe shortages in secondary across the country. PISA data shows this, particularly in maths and science, but also in languages. At the moment in Australia, 15-year-olds, 1 in 3 Year 9 students, because that's the age they do PISA, 1 in 9 Year 9 students is being taught maths by an out-of-field teacher, and 1 in 4 is being taught science, 1 in 4, by an out-of-field teacher. It's a national disgrace. And we're not doing anything about it. We've just left it to the forces of deregulation to work it out. I'm involved with a project at the moment involving Melbourne and 3 other universities, and what we're trying to do, it's called REM STEP. You can look it up. You've got to have a sexy acronym if you're going to have a project. But it's trying to reconceptualise how we train maths and science teachers, but particularly primary teachers too. It's a cycle that needs to be broken. The fact that we have kids going into primary and already the gap in literacy achievement development's 3-4 years. Many people feel inadequately prepared to teach certain subject areas. Kids get to Year 9, as I said, 1 in 3 maths, 1 in 4 science. Any wonder they're not taking the high levels of maths and science at high school. Any wonder they're not taking maths and science at university. Any wonder we've got a shortage of maths and science teachers. It's a long-term cycle that needs to be broken, which is what we're attempting to do. But it's not going to be a quick fix. And when we started this project, we were asked by the government last year, how long will it be before we can see improved results on NAPLAN? I said maybe 10 years, because that's how long it takes. It's a cycle. It's a long-term cycle. And people want quick fixes. So UK in particular, moving teacher education back to schools. What's happening is that the education faculties are collapsing in some cases. Some of them have gone out of business. Some of them have amalgamated. Some of them have become education policy studies areas. So what we've got now is a disconnect between research and practice. We've always talked about this as being problematic. It's one of the things we've tried to remedy at Melbourne, but this is going to exacerbate that. And you're going to see a situation basically where people are being prepared in schools, and they may be very well prepared in some schools, they may not be very well prepared in other schools. The motivation will be money. In some of these schools, they'll be questionable schools, particularly the frees and the academies and the chains and so forth. It's a way of punishing education faculties in some ways. And some universities, Birmingham for example, they're opening their own school to try and maintain that contact. Okay. Now this was the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. And again, some of the myths which are not supported by research, in fact they make a good job of demolishing these. Only content knowledge matters. So this is mass generalisation. For example, in Australia, every year they publish the ATAR scores for some of the lowest entry university courses. Fewer than 30% of teachers now go into teacher training with an ATAR, increasingly their graduate entry. And the ATAR itself, I think, is a bit of a dead fish when it comes to being some sort of indicator of quality. It's gamed so much. There are so many regional bonus schemes and principal bonus schemes and everything else. We should forget all about ATAR, but we should have the highest entry standards we can possibly have. Some people will tell you it doesn't matter. What people go into teacher education with, it's what they go out with that matters. I'm sorry, but it does matter. Somebody, for example, who maybe finishes high school with an ATAR of 40, they are going to be teaching, if they get through their course, kids who are potential 99.9 kids in, say, Year 5 mathematics or whatever it happens to be. It matters. And I'm very fortunate to work at a university which has got high entry standards and high quality people coming in, as well as a good quality program. But it matters. And this notion, and Julia Gillard put this notion, unfortunately, was that the main thing is that people get the opportunity to go to university. We need 42% of all the young people to go to university, and teacher education is a good way to get a tertiary education. Fact is, if people are going into a course They may or may not pass. That's the first problem. They're then soaking up school time, goodwill for placements. Some of them are not going to get jobs, particularly from some of the new colleges that are entering teacher education. I think that's reprehensible, to promise people something that they can't get. If it's important for 42% of young Australians to go to university, then let them study arts or something similar, something generic, and then make up their mind they want to be a teacher, if that's what they want to do. But simply saying teacher education is a social welfare, teacher education training is social welfare for certain people, I think is the wrong way to go about it. And I notice in your papers there's a 5-point plan, and one of them is about rigorous high standards for entry, and I would thoroughly support that, but I wouldn't support ATARs because it's a dead fish, as I said. So the variation is getting bigger. There are new colleges now getting involved in teacher education, and once it goes commercial even further, you'll see all sorts of people. And the trouble here is that friends of mine who are principals and so forth I come across will say, I will only hire teachers from certain universities. I will not hire somebody from this TAFE college who is now training primary and early childhood teachers, or this private college which is training teachers, secondary teachers and so forth. So I think what we're seeing in Australia is the gap between the top and the bottom getting wider. Now, I think we know what we need. Our big challenge is to make best practice common practice. For example, the current teacher accreditation requirements are far too low. They lack rigour to get your course accredited. I've been involved in doing this for a long time. I used to be on the New South Wales Institute of Teachers when it started, and I'm now on the Victorian Institute of Teaching. I like to say I'm the only person who was naughty enough to have to serve on both of those bodies. But I can tell you the standard's too low. And in the time that I've been involved with accrediting teacher education courses, I have never seen a course fail. Some of them just take a long time to get pushed over the bar. So we need to really upscale in this area. And that recent TMAG report, the TMAG report that was commissioned by Minister Pyne, has got a lot of potential. It's got a lot of things right. A couple of things were left out, but it got a lot of things right. But the challenge will be to see it actually implemented. Okay. So we had another review of teacher education. We've had a major one for at least every year for the last 30 years. I've almost stopped counting. In fact, Bill Loudon from Western Australia, he's counted all the minor ones too. He got to 101. He calls them 101 damnations. But this is the point. No other program of professional preparation has been thought to warrant such scrutiny. Each inquiry has come to much the same conclusions, made much the same recommendations, yet little has changed. We may see some change this time. Victoria's moving teacher education to these new academies. We'll see how that goes. But the key thing here is the relative mix between university and school involvement. Balance is quite important, and where I am, I don't want to give an ad for Melbourne, but we've done a lot of things to really make a very, very tight relationship with our base and partnership schools, and to the extent we've got 42 of these base schools where we pay the salary of half a teacher to work with our candidates. They're released from half their teaching, so we're taking it fairly seriously. But it's not just about time. One of the problems is that we tend to quantify these things. We have to have so many days. I'm more concerned about the quality than having to have 60 days of supervised practice in a Master of Teacher degree, for example. The new entrants to teacher education worry me a great deal. A lot of these colleges that are coming in now and training teachers have, shall we say, lower standards in some ways. Often they're linked up with other universities to get accredited in the first place. I am concerned about their standards. In some cases, they don't use ATARs at all. I'm all for having safety nets and ways of people getting into the profession if they've been disadvantaged in various ways, but it shouldn't mean an overall drop in the standard to accommodate them. So that's part of that greater deregulation in higher education generally that we're seeing, particularly the uncapping of the undergraduate places and so on. Okay, the big business, number 5. Now, big business Foyle's always been involved in education, textbooks, resources, various things, but we've never seen the extent of the involvement that we're seeing now. It's large-scale vertical integration. They're getting involved with curricula, teaching resources, teaching standards, teacher training, development and appraisal, student assessment and testing. In fact, they're getting control of the entire education supply chain. And I think it does set up something of a conflict of interest, where the people who are doing the testing of students and the appraising of teachers then turn round and say, and we've got the products to help you improve your performance. I think there's a slight conflict of interest there. Now, this is not illegal. They're responding to opportunity, but they are very persistent. They are knocking on education ministers' doors and directors general doors every day of the week. And they're offering big money, and they're offering promises about improved performance. It really needs to be subject to very, very close scrutiny. The influence is getting to be substantial. They will be opening their own schools when for-profit schools are available in Australia. They will be. And in fact, they're already sponsoring education faculties and certain schools anyway. Just a few things about the education publishers. They're the biggest publishers in the world. Bigger than anything else. They also own lots of little publishers as well that you may not, normally notice as being part of the big conglomerate. They're dealing in information. They are going around the world right now hoovering up content, and they are hiring educators hand over fist. And in particular the digital future. And so, some of the things that are coming out about the use of technology are fairly cautionary. Throwing iPads at schools, for example, has actually been found to lower educational achievement. The thing about technology is racing ahead of the pedagogy, racing ahead of it. And we really need to get our pedagogy right before we start spending a lot of money on the technology. So, to round up a bit, the global education reform movement, it is more than just a sort of transactional type thing. This is something organic, and it's very, very powerful. And it's getting increased traction and support in Australia. And the thing that worries me is these things have been accepted almost without questioning. And where the evidence has been provided or is available, the evidence has been ignored. We are doing the wrong things. We are doing the wrong things. I'm sounding like Tony Abbott saying things twice. I better stop that. So, I won't say it 3 times though. The rhetoric. I have said that 3 times. But it's really causing this erosion of confidence in public education. Now, Pi Delta Kappa in the US is a professional journal, and they've been having an annual survey of the public's opinion of public education for more than 35 years. And every year they ask the same questions, and they get the same phenomenon coming out, although it's changing a little bit. But when you ask the average person what's public education like, they'll tell you it's in crisis, it's underperforming, teachers don't care, kids are violent, all sorts of issues. And then you ask them, what's your local public school like? Oh, it's good. Teachers care, they're doing a real good job, they try really hard, etc., etc. So you've got this mismatch between this global perception that's being fed by people with varying interests and the local reality. It's the old thing about, think global, act locally, I should say. Okay. But erosion of confidence in and dismantling of public education. And the thing is, it hasn't worked. It's not working. But as more and more resources and kids and teachers are sucked out of public education, it may well appear to be working. We need to stop doing those wrong things. Now, again, with my hat on as ACE president, which covers the whole waterfront in terms of educators, my point there is quite simple. A good public education system is good for everyone. Keeping people involved in teaching and education and training is good for everyone. It's not a matter of one particular sector. The other thing about this, I think, I've got there, education shouldn't be about user pays or survival of the most advantaged. But the other thing here is that the real causes of the achievement gap in Australia are not being addressed. The equity gap in Australia is rising. It's getting wider, whichever way you want to express it. That's what Gonski was trying to do something about. We get research every now and then that comes out, as recently as a week or two ago, showing that kids do better in public education, all those sorts of things, and that's sort of a good counter to some of this, but it's a relentless tide in some ways. I find it interesting that when NAPLAN was introduced and my school and so forth came out, the people who were most concerned about it were people like yourself. The fact that there'd be naming and shaming and league tables and all that sort of stuff. You know who wants to pull down NAPLAN in my school now? Predominantly it's people in private schools, because what that's shown very, very clearly is that there are many schools in affluent areas which are well below the line predicted by SES, for example. They're actually coasting. They're doing okay, their results are good, but they're actually suboptimal, they're coasting. And that's being revealed. But as I said, it's not just a matter of trying to defend public education, we need to defend education. Because as I've been saying to my colleagues in the non-government sector, this is going to be just as disruptive to you as it is to those in public education. Now, there's a book by Wilkinson and Pickett that came out in 2009 called The Spirit Level. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a bit of an eye-opener, because what it basically proves is that inequality in society is actually worse, makes things worse for everyone. And where you have a have and have-not situation, it's actually worse for everyone. So it's a very interesting book. Now, it's not a matter of just saying how much money. We need to target the funding to those things that have the most influence on student achievement. Things like teachers' professional learning, we know has a very large effect on student achievement. The building education revolution stuff was nice, 16, 17 billion at the end of the day. A lot of schools got buildings they wouldn't have got otherwise. But I would have liked even $500 million to be taken out of that bucket and put into the teachers' professional learning and leadership preparation bucket, because we would have had substantial improvements, particularly if what we were doing was evidence-based. So, getting towards my conclusion, end of time here, I think if these developments continue and they're not challenged, and that requires all of us to get together, I think the outcomes will be greater inequity and continuing decline in educational performance, which will give people the evidence, in inverted commas, for even more far-reaching change. In effect, throwing petrol on the fire. Now, I've used this analogy of the tsunami a bit, but I think it's not a bad one. Very long wavelengths. They come from far away, across the Pacific. And by the time we notice them, it's almost too late to do anything about them. We need to subject these changes to scrutiny. And if we remain silent or we're silenced in the face of some of these developments, then partly it'll be our own fault. Surely, before we make any changes, major fundamental changes, we should subject those to scrutiny. And I like to use the medical analogy too. In medicine, before you can introduce a new drug or treatment, it has to go through a whole series of trials, randomised control, injecting poor old mice or rats or whatever it happens to be, and eventually at the end of the day, providing it does what it's supposed to do, in other words, it's fit for purpose and it doesn't cause any side effects, it can be introduced. In education, we don't do that. We introduce stuff willy-nilly, 13 things at a time, hope for the best, and we don't really take the care that we should. And it's not too much to say that lives are also at stake in our schools if what we're doing is not evidence-based. There's some references there. You've got the Worst of Both Worlds paper. The Journal of Professional Learning, I'm pleased to give a plug to, Federation Journal. That has something that I did there on pseudoscience in education, inequity and decline. Thanks to Dennis for that. There's another one there on the quality teaching movement in Australia from the Australian Journal of Education that might be of interest. Thank you.